Resentment has a way of sitting in the body. You can feel it, even when you know you need to let it go, and you don't know how. And then there are those moments where you've done something, and afterward, you carry it. That heaviness, that weight, that feeling you can't quite shake. And today we're going to look at what that feeling really is and what it actually means to release it. For me, this showed up in my relationship with my parents. Most of my life into my early 30s, I blamed my dad for my childhood. And I saw my mom more like a sibling than a parent, because in many ways, that was the role she lived in. I didn't fear her like I feared him. But as I tried to sort out the trauma and the pain from childhood, something began to build. And I started to recognize I held anger toward her because I believed she should have protected us. And those feelings lived under the surface for years, until one night I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of my mom's voice calling my name. I sat up, looking around, but no one was there. And I knew in that way you just know certain things, that I was being shown something, that it was time to stop carrying what I had been carrying, that the wound was ready to be looked at. And I've always been someone who, when I understand something, I take care of it. So I knew it was time. Time to release it, and time to be honest about what I was holding. I knew I had to have a conversation with her, and I was terrified. Because having a voice in my family was not something that was received. Conversations like that were often shut down, dismissed, minimized. But I wanted to release the resentment so we could move forward, understand each other, and heal. And so I called her and asked if I could come over for a coffee. I remember sitting on her couch and talking about the small things, trying to gather the courage to speak. And I did what I always had done. I tried to make it safe for her, so I could feel safe enough to speak. I want to talk to you about something, but don't worry, everything is safe. And then I would begin. And this day was no different. But when I started that conversation, I could feel it. The tension, the distance, her body language said everything. She wasn't cold, but she wasn't open either. And I understand this was how she had learned to move through life, not to be emotionally present. Somewhere along the way, feeling had become too painful, and so distance and detachment became her way of coping. And in that moment, I knew she loved me in the way she knew how. But emotionally, she couldn't meet me there, and I understand why. Because her own childhood, her own experiences, I had been able to give grace for that. Some people choose to grow, and some people get stuck in what they've known. And I had to leave that day knowing I had done my part and that she could only receive it at the level she was able to. And I had to be okay with that. Forgiveness from my parents came from seeing them, not just as parents, but as people, who once had been children themselves, trying to adapt, trying to belong in the circumstances they were given. In life, I stopped giving so much weight to the labels we attach to people. Mother, father, sibling. And with that, the expectations began to fall away. They no longer had to be anything other than who they were. And it allowed me to see the soul, the person beneath the role, and the life they had lived that shaped how they showed up. I've always been someone who looks at a person, and instead of asking, why would they do that? I find myself asking, what happened to them? What is their story? And it gave me a completely different way of seeing them, not from my wounds, but from a place of understanding. And when that began to shift, so did everything I thought forgiveness was. And these words from T.D. Jakes helped open that door for me. He said that there are people among us who are voluminous, who are 10-gallon people, but we may have been born into families of people with only pint-sized capacity. And when you're a 10-gallon person, you want love on a 10-gallon level. But a pint-sized person, they can only give you everything they have, sincerely give you all of themselves, and it still doesn't fill you up. Not because they don't love you, but because that's all they have to give. And when I heard that, I remember weeping, because it felt like someone had finally put into words what I had never been able to understand up until that point. And it was one view that helped change how I began to see forgiveness. And this brings me to forgiveness in the areas of our lives and the people we have to find our way through. For many of us, it begins with our parents, because so much of what we carry was shaped in those early years. The ways we felt let down, unprotected, unseen. The moments that stayed with us when we didn't feel chosen or encouraged, when the attaboy or the attagirl never came, or when they didn't show up in the ways we needed them to. If you come from a more painful or traumatic past, this becomes one of the deepest places you have to walk through, because this is where so much of the wound lives. And the trap is the wound can start to feel like identity. Like if you release it, you lose a story of what happened to you. Like letting go means it didn't matter, but it did matter. It does matter. And as long as we stay inside the wound, we move through life reacting, easily triggered, still relating to the present from what once hurt us, instead of from who we are now. But through this kind of inner work, there comes a point where something begins to shift. And getting there isn't clean. It isn't linear. You'll think you've released it, and then something small, a tone of voice, a moment of feeling unseen, will pull you right back. And that's okay. It's all part of it. But you keep going, and eventually it no longer feels like you're being pulled under, like something is wrapped around you, anchored to you, dragging you back into the same place, the same pain, the same heartache, again and again. And instead, something begins to loosen, like you've cut yourself free, and you're no longer fighting to stay above the surface, but able to rise. And for the first time, you can breathe. And you begin to realize you don't have to live from that place anymore. And this isn't about letting them off the hook or giving them a free pass. It's about freeing your heart from what you've been holding. And this is something I speak about in my book, Uprooting Shame and Guilt. Because to get to the place I am now, where the past feels like another lifetime, I had to walk through it. And a massive part of that journey began with forgiving my parents. But that was only part of it, because what I discovered along the way was that I also had to turn that same compassion inward. And sometimes a harder conversation is the one we have to have with ourselves. In one way or another, we have all done things that don't align with who we know ourselves to be. And we carry that, the shame, the guilt. And they're not the same thing. Guilt says I did something wrong. Shame says I am something wrong. And shame is a heavier one, because it doesn't just live in what you did. It lives in how you see yourself. And if we don't face it, it stays with us. It keeps us stuck in ways we don't always see, because it begins to shape not just how we see ourselves, but what we believe we deserve. And healing is about finding a way through that, because to be free is what we are here for, to heal, to learn, to grow. So we don't keep repeating what once hurt us and others. And there are times when self-forgiveness shows up in our relationships, not just in what we've done, but what we have allowed, for staying, for going back, for not leaving sooner. And that can be one of the hardest places to meet yourself with compassion, because somewhere along the way, you made the best decision you could, with what you had at the time, with what you knew, with what you believed you deserved. And sometimes a doorway into forgiving others begins with looking at ourselves. Because when you reflect on something you've needed forgiveness for, something you regret, something you wish you had done differently, it can soften something within you. It begins to show you that we are all capable of causing pain from a place of our own wounds. And when you really sit with that, something shifts. You stop seeing the people who hurt you as something other than human. And that awareness unlocks something within you that had been keeping you tied to the pain. And it's from that place that we can begin to look outward at the people who have hurt us. And again, this isn't about a free pass. It's about you and your freedom. Because when you hold on to it, you don't just remember what happened. You keep returning to it, replaying it, revisiting it, reliving it as if it's still holding on in the present. And it begins to shape how you move, what you expect, what you guard against, how you show up, until it can start to feel like you're being held captive to something that has already ended, like they are still your captor, even though the moment is long gone. And the hardest thing to sit with is that the door isn't locked. It never was. But something in us keeps choosing the familiar pain over the unknown of what is on the other side. And so without even realizing it, we hand them a power they no longer actually hold. And we become the ones maintaining our own captivity. Not because of what they did, but because of what we continue to carry. And forgiveness is what begins to change that. It doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't rewrite it, but it does something quieter and more profound than that. It stops the past from having a vote in your present. And that is where something new becomes possible. And finally, there's the part we don't always talk about. When we are the one who needs to make it right, to apologize, to take ownership. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because it requires something of us that we can't rehearse our way out of. We have to show up without knowing how it will land, without knowing if it will be received, without knowing if it will matter to them at all. That's the exposure of it. And we don't control what comes back, but that was never our role. Our role is to take responsibility, to be honest, to do what we know is right and mean it. And this is where we can get caught, not in the apology itself, but in what we hope follows it. We want them to understand, to acknowledge it, to meet us in it. We want to feel that it landed, that it counted, that it mattered. And when that doesn't happen, it can quietly hollow out what we just did. And without realizing it, we've handed them the verdict of our own integrity. Because now how we feel about what we did depends entirely on how they respond. But the act of taking responsibility doesn't require their participation to be real. It was real the moment you chose it. And to also remember that just as we've needed grace from others, there are still parts of ourselves we haven't fully released. And moving through all of this, the resentment, the self-judgment, the need for a response that may never come, is what brings you back into your own life. Not lighter in the way you imagined it would feel, but clearer, more grounded in who you are and less at the mercy of what once defined you. And I want to offer you this soul musing for reflection. Forgiveness is an olive branch, not only to others, but to yourself. It is like sinking in quicksand, where an invisible hand reaches out, pulling you from the muck and placing your feet back on solid ground. I will leave you with these questions for reflection. Where in my life am I still holding on to something that is keeping me tied to the past? Is there a place within me where I am carrying shame or guilt and withholding forgiveness from myself? What might begin to shift if I allow myself to loosen my grip and no longer carry this in the same way? If this conversation resonated with you, you may be interested in this video. You're not broken, you're conditioned. Because I truly believe that when we begin healing ourselves, we create more compassion, more understanding, and ultimately a better world for everyone. With much love, I'll see you in the next video.